Of 5, sent wooden match burned for 3 seconds, one spark, and an entire German sniper network collapsed. Most people still think the deadliest weapons in the Hürtgen forest were rifles, artillery, or numbers. They're wrong. What broke the forest wasn't firepower. It was psychology, and once you understand why that match worked, you'll understand how one impossible idea rewrote counters, sniper doctrine, and turned a single rifleman into the most efficient killer in the woods. Most people have no idea that one of the deadliest tactics the U.S. Army ever used in the Hürtgen forest wasn't classified, wasn't advanced, and wasn't even designed as a weapon. It was a match, a 3-second flame, a 5-cent piece of trash, and the moment you understand why it worked, you'll see how one backward idea collapsed an entire German sniper system, exposed a flaw no training manual accounted for, and turned Sergeant William Ashworth into the most dangerous man in the forest. What happened on December 9th wasn't luck. It wasn't superior marksmanship. It was a psychological trap so simple, so counter-intuitive, that German veterans never developed a defense for it. 119 soldiers died the moment they followed their own training. Stay to the end and you'll understand the real secret. Not how the match worked, but why it worked. Why trained professionals reacted exactly as Ashworth predicted, and why this forgotten 4-day engagement became one of the most devastating and least understood turning points of the Forest campaign. The Germans didn't lose because Ashworth hid from them. They lost because he made them look directly at the thing that killed them. The first time Ashworth used the match, no one, not even his spotter, fully understood what he was attempting. At 5:30 a.m. on December 9th, the woods weren't just dark. They were structurally hostile. The Hürtgen forest absorbed sound, swallowed light, and punished hesitation. Fog clung low to the ground. Snow muted footsteps. Trunks and undergrowth shattered lines of sight into fragments. German snipers owned the terrain. They had spent weeks cutting firing hides into the forest itself, slots invisible to the naked eye. Each position was measured, rehearsed, and tied into overlapping fields of fire. They fired rarely, moved deliberately, and revealed nothing without purpose. American infantry had a saying for the place: if it moves, it dies. If it doesn't move, it still might. By that morning, Sergeant William Ashworth decided that wasn't acceptable, not for him, not for the men pinned behind him, not for a division that needed a break through just to survive another day. Ashworth crawled into position with one conclusion already settled in his mind. Traditional counter-sniper doctrine would fail here. The Germans were too disciplined. Waiting them out meant bleeding slowly. Hunting them blind meant exposing yourself to shooters you would never see. So Ashworth did something doctrine explicitly warned against. He ignored it. Before Private Kowalski could even settle his binoculars, Ashworth slid 13 steps to a secondary position, quietly and deliberately, already preparing to bait an enemy that believed it was immune to being baited. Ashworth wasn't planning to hide from the snipers. He was planning to control what they looked at. And in the Hürtgen forest, the moment a sniper looks where you want him to look, he's already dead. Not hidden, not fortified, just plausible. A place a careless sniper might have used. He pulled the matchbox from his pocket, struck a flame, held it steady, and then moved back to the real nest without a sound. That was the part most people misunderstand. The match wasn't bait for Germans. It was a calibration tool for Ashworth. A match flare created a predictable reaction. A predictable reaction produced a predictable exposure, and a predictable exposure let him place a bullet with factory floor efficiency. The German who died first never knew he'd participated in a test. What mattered wasn't the kill. What mattered was the confirmation. German doctrine was intact. German reflexes were intact. German predictability was intact. Ashworth now had the one ingredient snipers rarely get: total control over enemy behavior. He didn't say a word. He simply made a second mark in his notebook. Not a tally, not a boast, just data. Kowalski finally whispered, "What the hell are we doing?" When UV Ashworth didn't look up, finding them faster than they can find us. That was the true inflection point of the entire 4-day engagement. Most snipers try to disappear into terrain. Ashworth disappeared into behavior. The first flare hadn't just flushed out a target. It had exposed something more valuable, the German mental model. German training emphasized three primary indicators of hostile presence movement. Sound, light, but in Herken, movement was scarce, sound was distorted, and muzzle flashes were almost non-existent under canopy. Light, however, no matter how small, remained the one universal trigger. Ashworth wasn't hunting men, he was hunting reactions, and that changed everything. From his position behind the shattered oak, he studied the forest not as geography, but as circuitry inputs and outputs. If he placed light here, what would move there? If he shifted angle, who would shift back? If he created a pattern, who would respond? And how fast? Every sniper shot that morning was a piece of feedback. Every confirmed kill was a data point. Every silence was a signal. It made the forest readable. The average soldier sees trees, branches, fog, and shadows. Ashworth saw a decision tree, and at the end of every branch was a single question. Where will they look next? H, not where are they hiding. Where there's dime, not where will they fire from. He sighed. But where will their training force them to focus? Once he understood that the kills became almost secondary. What mattered to Ashworth was timing. How long it took for a German to notice the match. How quickly they adjusted. How completely they broke their camouflage when doing so. Kowalski watched him track these micro-movements like a mathematician building a model. This isn't sniping, the spotter muttered once. This is prediction. It's docks and wires. Ashworth finally looked over. Sniping is prediction. The Army just teaches the slow version, one herd dated. By mid-morning, he had already mapped 2 sniper hides and 1 observer position without a single American taking fire. The method was simple, but the reasoning behind it was ruthless. If you know how a soldier thinks, you know how he reveals himself. And if you control the reveal, you control the kill. That was the moment Ashworth crossed an invisible threshold. He wasn't improvising anymore. He wasn't testing an idea. He had identified a systemic flaw in German tactical psychology, and he intended to exploit it down to the last man in the sector. The Matchbox Trick wasn't a gimmick. It was an interface, a way to convert doctrine into vulnerability, a way to make reactions predictable, a way to reduce deadly combat into a solvable equation. By noon, he wasn't asking if it would keep working. He was asking how far he could push it. And the forest, for the first time in days, felt less like a trap and more like a machine he had just learned to operate. Most accounts of Ashworth focus on what he did. Very few explain why he was the only man who would even think to do it. Because long before the Matchbox Trick appeared in the Herken forest, the idea behind it was already forming slowly, quietly in a place that had nothing to do with war. Harlan County, Kentucky. Ashworth grew up in terrain that punished assumptions. Coal country didn't care how good you were on your best day. It cared how well you reacted on your worst, and in the mines, survival wasn't about strength or technique. It was about recognizing patterns before they killed you. Gas buildup, shifts in timber, subtle changes in airflow, small signs that predicted catastrophe. You learned to notice what others ignored, or you didn't live very long. Ashworth learned early that the world wasn't dangerous because it was violent. It was dangerous because it was predictable in ways people refused to see. That mindset became his default stance. Don't trust the rules. Study the behavior behind them. Then decide if the rule deserves to exist. By 12, he was shooting rabbits not by tracking their bodies, but by reading their reactions, where they froze, when they twitched, how far they'd bolt. Every shot was preceded by a forecast, not guesswork. By 17, he didn't describe himself as a marksman. He described himself as a man who watches. If you consider straight, that distinction mattered. Most snipers think in terms of accuracy. Ashworth thought in terms of anticipation. The Army didn't teach that. Life did. When his father died in a mine collapse, Ashworth didn't inherit grief. He inherited responsibility. Now, he wasn't just watching for himself. He was watching for a family that depended on his judgment. That sharpened everything. Awareness became duty. So when the war came and the 28th Division needed bodies, Ashworth wasn't drawn to the rifle because he enjoyed shooting. He was drawn to it because it was the purest tool for converting awareness into consequence. At Camp Perry, instructors praised his marksmanship. But what unsettled them was something else. He didn't frame problems the way other recruits did, where they asked, "How do I hide two Art Maxes?" Ashworth asked, "What makes an enemy look?" Was it where they asked, "How do I avoid detection is mine?" Ashworth asked, "What is the trigger that causes detection, if you errest where doctrine preaches?" Invisibility, he saw a dead end. If both sides are invisible, the side that waits loses time, loses initiative, and eventually loses men. So Ashworth began looking for the one question doctrine never addressed. What if you could make the enemy reveal himself without firing a shot, and without showing yourself? His instructors dismissed the idea entirely. Sniping, they insisted, was built on patience and self-erasure. Let the enemy expose himself, never manipulate, never bait, never announce presence, never break pattern. Ashworth didn't argue. He simply logged their answers as one more predictable system, another structure waiting to be reverse-engineered. When he deployed to Europe in 1943, he carried two things: a rifle he trusted and a quiet belief that doctrine wasn't scripture. Normandy hardened that. German snipers on the Western Front weren't reckless. They were disciplined, slow, methodical. Ashworth got 17 confirmed kills, but none came from flashy shots. They came from behavioral tells, tiny deviations in foliage, seconds of hesitation, predictable reposition timing. He didn't beat German marksmen because he was faster. He beat them because he understood them, but in Hurtgen something changed. The forest neutralized every conventional tool of prediction. No long sight lines, no reliable sound, no obvious firing lanes, no muzzle flashes, no movement windows. A sniper who relied on stealth here was trapped. A sniper who relied on patience here was dead weight. A sniper who waited for an opportunity was guaranteeing that the Germans would decide the outcome. Ashworth realized the only way out was to flip the equation. If German snipers refused to reveal themselves, then he would create the condition that forced them to reveal themselves, not by noise, not by movement, not by decoys, but by attacking the one reflex they couldn't suppress. Orientation to light. A match wasn't a weapon. It was a psychological lever, and unlike movement or sound, every soldier responded to it instantly and automatically. Ashworth wasn't looking for brilliance. He was looking for certainty, certainty that German doctrine hadn't adapted, certainty that instinct would override caution, certainty that once he triggered the reaction, he'd have half a second of target exposure. Half a second was all he needed. By the time Ashworth lit the first match on December 9th, the trick wasn't improvisation. It was the natural endpoint of everything he'd learned, from mines, from rabbits, from doctrine, from Normandy, and from the forest itself. It wasn't madness. It was logic. A logic only one man in Hurtgen understood, and one that was about to tear a hole straight through the German sniper network. The first kill proved the idea. The second kill proved the system. By mid-morning on December 9th, Ashworth wasn't experimenting anymore. He was collecting data with the precision of an engineer. The match had revealed one sniper hide and one spotter, but the forest didn't contain two men. It contained dozens, and Ashworth intended to map them all. He repositioned only when the terrain forced it, never because a pattern felt complete. Patterns in Hurtgen were illusions. The Germans built their hides in clusters, overlapping arcs, mutually supporting angles. A dead sniper didn't reduce danger. It signaled that two more had perfect view of the place where you killed him. Most Americans feared the forest because its threats were invisible. Ashworth feared it because its threats were predictable. His second engagement began exactly the same way as the first. He lit a match in a false position 15 D from his real firing nest. 3 seconds of flame extinguished, then silence. Kowalski watched the tree like a man expecting ghosts. No movement, he whispered after 20 seconds. "Wait," Ashworth murmured. German observer didn't move fast. They moved right. At 45 seconds, Kowalski saw the tell. A subtle shift in a brush pile, no more than a fraction of an inch. But that fractional shift indicated a head-adjusting angle, a slight realignment, a trained response that doctrine demanded. Ashworth didn't need a silhouette. He needed a direction. He fired once. A quiet collapse followed. The third kill came 90 seconds later. The dead sniper spotter reacting to the second match position. 2 engagements, 4 bodies, 0 shots fired at American lines. This wasn't sniping. This was extraction, pulling opponents out of camouflage like teeth from a jaw. By noon, Ashworth had repeated the cycle 4 more times. Not quickly, not aggressively, deliberately. Each match revealed something. How long Germans took to respond. How wide their arcs of observation extended. Whether spotters moved before snipers. How terrain distorted their positioning. How long they lingered after seeing light. Every reaction fleshed out the mental architecture of the enemy team. Kowalski at first was exhilarated by the success. Then he started counting seconds. "Bill," he whispered, "every time you spark that thing, they're aiming at the wrong place in 24 force." "Exactly 7, that doesn't scare you. I have said it not reset. It should scare them more. He have because here was the truth that didn't make it into after-action reports." Ashworth wasn't gambling with his life. He was gambling with their assumptions. German sharpshooters had spent months perfecting concealment techniques, adjusting blinds, cutting shooting lanes invisible from the ground, camouflaging with moss, soil, bark. Their skill was real, their discipline was real, but none of that mattered if Ashworth never looked for them directly. The match reorganized the battlefield. Instead of searching the forest for enemy hides, he forced the hides to betray themselves. Instead of scanning broad terrain, he watched narrow funnels of expected reaction. Instead of fearing the German network, he began mapping it. By sundown, the map was clear. Ashworth had generated 14 confirmed kills and identified 2 additional hide positions he hadn't yet engaged. More importantly, German sniper activity in his sector had dropped sharply, not because the Germans had stopped shooting, but because they had shifted attention to the match positions, not the infantry behind him. They were reacting to the pattern. He was shaping it. That night, as they dug into a shallow scrape for rest, Kowalski finally voiced the fear forming at the edges of his mind. What if they adapt? They dill that read. Ashworth didn't pause. "Good adaptations are predictable, too. Bill, you're not worried they'll stop looking after 7. Not tomorrow," Ashworth said. "Not after 1 day. Doctrine doesn't rewrite itself overnight." Oh, doctrine was the one opponent Ashworth trusted completely. And on December 9th, doctrine had behaved exactly the way he needed, but he didn't sleep. Not because he doubted the trick, but because he understood the next day would demand refinement. The Germans would not die the same way twice. They would adjust angles, reposition hides, tighten discipline, and if he couldn't stay ahead of them, the entire system would collapse. At dawn on December 10th, the forest delivered a new variable one that would have paralyzed a conventional sniper. Fog dense, wet. Visibility reduced to 30 yards. For most snipers, fog was a barrier. For Ashworth, it was an amplifier. Yesterday, matches revealed hides. Today, they would reveal patterns. The trick would evolve. The battlefield would change. The Germans would respond. And Ashworth was ready to push the Matchbox Trick into something far more dangerous than bait. He was going to turn light into a weaponized pattern generator. The fog on December 10th didn't roll in, it materialized. 1 minute, the trees were visible. The next minute, the entire forest was a gray wall. Most snipers would have packed up and waited for clarity. Fog erased depth. Fog distorted angles. Fog turned the Hurricane into a sensory dead zone. But for Ashworth, the fog solved a core problem he'd been wrestling with since dawn the day before. The match revealed Germans, but the Germans also revealed the match. Fog broke that symmetry. In clear light, a match sparked at maybe 50 yards. In fog, the flame pushed through the haze long before a human outline could. It created a temporary advantage, brief, fragile, but real. Ashworth understood instantly. Yesterday he'd pulled snipers out one by one. Today he could pull out entire teams. He didn't begin with a single match. He began with 3. He and Kowalski crawled into a B-shaped depression overlooking a suspected German observation point, an entanglement of fallen timber that intelligence believed housed at least 2 shooters and a spotter. Ashworth scanned the fog without looking for shapes. Shapes were irrelevant. What mattered was where men needed to look to do their job. He struck the first match 40 yards north of his nest, 2 seconds out. 30 seconds later, he lit the second match 30 yards to the west. Same duration out. Kowalski tracked the fog like a radar dish. No movement yet, he whispered. Wait for the third, 8. The third match flared 20 yards to the south. This was the first true stress test of the system. 1 match triggered orientation. 2 matches triggered attention. 3 matches forced prioritization. And prioritization is when human reaction becomes predictable. At the German hide, Kowalski finally saw it. A faint shift in the fallen timber. Then another 2 separate adjustments from 2 separate positions. Not dramatic movements, just enough to track 3 light sources, and decide which one posed the highest threat. That moment was the crack Ashworth needed. 2 in the pile, Kowalski murmured, good. If you wanted the stories, Ashworth didn't fire, not yet. 3 matches had identified them, the 4th would expose them. He crawled forward, not toward the Germans, but toward a small rise that placed him at a sharper angle to the suspected hides. He struck the 4th match and didn't hold it in his hand. He planted it, letting it burn openly on a thin strip of bark. The flame flickered a foot above the ground, clear as a beacon, barely 25 yards from the German position. This wasn't bait. This was command. You cannot train men to ignore a threat directly in front of their kill zone. You can only hope they react slowly. These didn't. 2 silhouettes shifted simultaneously. Sniper and spotter trying to realign for an immediate counterot. That was their mistake. Ashworth had already settled into the firing nest. The Springfield cracked once. The first silhouette fell. The second shot came less than a second later. The spotter dropped. A third German, realizing the trap too late, tried to retreat deeper into brush. The third round caught him mid-step. 11 seconds, 3 bodies, 0 German rounds fired. Kowalski exhaled like he'd been underwater. That was a firing squad. We never won. No, Ashworth said that was pattern pressure. If 5 primers and pattern pressure quickly became the theme of day 2, the fog allowed him to push the trick further. Instead of creating a single focal point, he created sequence logic, a chain the Germans couldn't stop themselves from following. Match orientation, 2nd match adjustment, 3rd match confirmation, 4th match exposure. It was mechanical, predictable, and devastating. By 080 hours, Ashworth had executed 3 multi-match sequences. By noon, the kill count for day 2 had already reached 19. But the real evolution wasn't in the number of kills. It was in the types of kills. The day before, he'd pulled out snipers. Now he was pulling out observers, radiomen, machine gun crews, anyone trained to monitor enemy signals. German soldiers were no longer reacting individually. They were reacting collectively. A match didn't just attract a pair of eyes. It attracted entire fire teams conditioned to orient on light. The Matchbox Trick was no longer a tactic. It was becoming a systemic exploit. Kowalski finally voiced the obvious. They're not adapting. They're doubling down. End quote. They can't stop. Ashworth said their doctrine is built on light discipline. They see it, they mark it, and fog makes that instinct stronger, not weaker. To end quote, end quote. He wasn't fighting German snipers anymore. He was fighting German training architecture. That was the insight that changed the entire engagement. A sniper can adapt. A doctrine cannot. Ashworth now understood his real opponent wasn't the men in front of him. It was the manual behind them. Fog had revealed the future. If he kept evolving the pattern, the Germans would keep reacting to it. If he escalated the logic, they would escalate their exposure. If he turned the battlefield into a decision tree, they would follow the branches he created, and he intended to follow this to its limit. Day 2 wasn't about kills. Day 2 was about proving one thing. If you can control what a soldier looks at, you control the soldier. By sunset, the forest was no longer a battlefield. It was an interface, and Ashworth was learning to operate it with frightening efficiency. By the morning of December 11th, the Germans finally understood something was wrong. Not what was wrong, not how it was happening, just that men were dying in ways doctrine couldn't explain. So, countermeasures went out. Every German sniper in Ashworth sector received the same briefing. Do not react to light. Do not turn your head. Do not adjust position. Ignore matches completely. On paper, it was the correct fix. If the enemy is using your reflex against you, eliminate the reflex, but paper solutions rarely survive the first hour of combat. Ashworth knew what this meant the moment Kowalski intercepted the briefing through fragments of radio chatter. "They're telling them not to look," Kowalski murmured. "That kills the trick." "Well, Fawningsov says no." Ashworth said calmly, "That opens a new one. We're exemplade because when you order men not to react to a stimulus, you isolate the stimulus. And once the stimulus becomes isolated, it becomes a tool for illumination." Ashworth's next evolution wasn't bait. It wasn't sequencing. It wasn't pattern pressure. It was backlighting. A sniper hiding in a log pile becomes invisible because light falls in front of him. Reverse the angle of light and the same sniper becomes a silhouette. That was the principle. Now he needed a battlefield test. At 6:30, the fog of the previous day had thinned, but canopy still suppressed sunlight. Shadows were deep, visibility was poor, noise traveled unevenly, perfect conditions. Ashworth began by identifying a machine gun nest that had pinned an American platoon for 2 days. He didn't fire. He didn't signal artillery. He didn't even reveal that he'd seen them. He studied the shadows, the angle of the logs, the depth of cover, the likely firing slit, the likely fallback position. Then he moved not toward the target, but behind it, a wide flank nearly 40 yards, positioning himself in a narrow seam where brush opened into a faint corridor of visibility. Kowalski watched him reposition with increasing confusion. "Why back there?" he hissed through the radio. "Because that's where the light needs to be, everyone." Ashworth struck a single match and held it behind him, arm extended. 3 seconds, that was all. But in those 3 seconds, something extraordinary happened. The flame didn't illuminate the Germans. It illuminated the space between them and Ashworth, creating a momentary outline. 3 heads, 2 shoulders, 1 firing aperture projected against the faint orange glow. It was enough. He extinguished the match. The forest collapsed back into shadow. Ashworth didn't need light anymore. He had the geometry. 7 seconds, 3 shots. The machine gun nest went silent. Kowalski, still adjusting to what he'd seen, said quietly, "That wasn't a trick. That was X-ray vision. If you rate, no." Ashworth replied, "That was doctrine inversion." Well, this body-do inversion quickly became the theme of the day. If the Germans refused to look at light, they couldn't see what light revealed behind them. And if they couldn't see what the light revealed, Ashworth could reconstruct their positions with surgical clarity. But he wasn't finished. Because day 3 was also the first day, he integrated the Matchbox system with a second weapon, artillery. It started with a captured German radio intercept, referencing a suspected company headquarters position. Hidden, protected, well-defended. A nightmare target for infantry. A wasteful target for artillery, unless you could draw out the men first. Ashworth didn't need to kill them. He needed to make them expose themselves long enough for someone else to. He placed 3 matches in a triangle around the command post, each 60 yards from the true target. He did not light them simultaneously. He lit them in sequence north, east, south, each flame positioned to simulate movement. The Germans responded exactly as a headquarters staff would. Officers emerged to assess infiltration. Runners emerged to relay warnings. Radio men emerged to verify lines. All of them stepped into the open. Lieutenant McKenna, the artillery observer, had been skeptical until that moment. Then he saw what Ashworth had created. A cluster of officers in perfect view, standing exactly where his fire mission needed them. Bill, Is that what I think it is? McKenna whispered, Yes. Well, with thanks for watching. You lit the way to their command post. Dollars, I have, yes. Do it again. Well, artillery came in fast. 6 rounds of 105 mm. Direct, precise, devastating. Estimated casualties 20 plus. Enemy command structure fractured. Kowalski stared at the burning wreckage. Bill, this is beyond sniping. 1. Ashworth didn't respond for a moment. When he finally did, his voice was flat. I'm not killing snipers anymore. I'm killing systems, B said. That was the pivot point of the entire battle. The Matchbox Trick was no longer about revealing individual enemies. It was about revealing organizational behavior, reaction hierarchy, command response, movement protocols, patterns of leadership. Once you understand how a force behaves under stimulus, you don't need to see it. You can predict it, and once you can predict it, you can shape it. Day 3 ended with a number far more important than the growing kill count. German coordination in the sector collapsed. Communications became erratic. Patrol timing broke down. Sniper support protocols fractured. Machine gun imp placements lost discipline. Headquarters units relocated in panic, leaving gaps that infantry exploited. All because the enemy did not understand a simple truth. The match wasn't the trick. Their reaction to it was, and Ashworth had just weaponized that reaction at scale. By December 12th, German commanders finally acknowledged the disaster. Their sniper network, a system they'd spent months perfecting, was coming apart in less than 100 hours. Snipers dead, spotters dead, observers dead, machine gun crews exposed, headquarters shelled, doctrinal response neutralized. So a new order went out. Find the American sniper, kill him immediately. Do not wait for ideal shots. Do not reposition. Advance aggressively in teams of 5. It was the first smart decision they'd made, and the last one they would make that day, because this was the moment Ashworth stopped waiting for reactions and began dictating movement. For the first time, he wasn't using matches to expose static targets. He was using matches to engineer motion to pull entire German patrols through terrain he had chosen, through angles he controlled, into kill zones he built. With the same precision a miner builds a collapse, this wasn't sniping anymore. This was battlefield shaping. First match trail. It began with 5 Germans experienced, disciplined, and hunting aggressively. They weren't scanning for light. They were scanning for Ashworth. That meant they were predictable. Predators are always predictable. Ashworth had prepared the terrain an hour earlier, placing 4 match positions across a 100-yard stretch, not random, not improvised. Each match was placed in a spot where a soldier might pause if he were moving carelessly. A stump cut flat, a jut of rock at knee height, a break in the undergrowth, a dip at the edge of a ravine. Matches weren't meant to be seen. The positions were. When the Germans arrived, the trail did exactly what Ashworth intended. It told them a story, a sloppy American sniper retreating under pressure, a man who kept stopping, a man adjusting gear, a man making mistakes, a man who could be killed, and hunters follow stories. Patrol advanced quickly, professionally spacing correct, sectors covered, rifles up. But they were following a path no American had walked. Only a match had from 70 yards away in a perfect elevation angle. Ashworth watched the patrol file into the open bowl of the kill zone. He didn't fire at first contact. He waited until 4 of the 5 were committed. No cover left, no escape path, no lateral mobility. Then he began. Shot 1 dropped the lead scout. Shot 2 caught the patrol leader pivoting. Shot 3 hit a rifleman diving for a stump. Shot 4 found the soldier mid-sprint. Shot 5 ended the last man just before he reached the tree line. 45 seconds, 5 targets. No German rifle ever fired back. Kowalski stared at the carnage, his voice thin. Bill, that wasn't counter-sniping. Prandry, no. Ashworth said that was routing behavior. Here's eyes, and routing behavior is more fragile than camouflage. Escalation, turning movement into vulnerability. The match trails worked because they weaponized something deeper than training, the human bias toward completion. When a soldier sees a partial pattern, footprints, disturbances, light, broken branches, he completes the pattern in his mind. Ashworth didn't create the pattern. He created the start of a pattern and let the Germans finish it incorrectly. Every match position reinforced the illusion of pursuit. Every illusion tightened the trap. 2 hours later, he built a second trail, this one leading into a ravine where he had elevation advantage and cross-angle cover. 3 Germans followed it. Only one made it 10 steps into the open. None made it out. By noon, German patrols were refusing to follow match trails at all. But refusing a trail created a new vulnerability: hesitation. Hesitation is a tell just as clear as orientation to light. Where they paused, Ashworth aimed. Where they clustered, he adjusted. Where they refused one path, they exposed another. But the real test of the Matchbox system came that afternoon, because for the first time in 4 days, Ashworth faced an opponent who actually understood him, the duel, a sniper who finally saw the pattern. It happened at 13. A single match flared to Ashworth's left 3 seconds. Clean, deliberate. A German sniper had just tried to reverse the trick. Kowalski froze. Bill, he's using your signal. Mass event, no. Ashworth said, he's using my language. If you won, this opponent wasn't baiting him. He was communicating. The German lit a second match 10 minutes later. Different angle, different elevation. Then a third. He was mapping Ashworth, trying to identify reaction time, movement direction, counter angles, trying to do exactly what Ashworth had done to dozens of others. 2 snipers. Neither willing to turn their head, neither willing to give a silhouette, neither willing to accept the first mistake. It became a psychological silence. 2 predators sharing the same hunting method, both aware that the first impulse would lose. For 2 hours, neither man fired. Small adjustments. Shifts in breathing, listening for twigs, not looking for light. Kowalski whispered, "How do we beat a man who thinks the same way?" Some thinking store passed. Ashworth answered without hesitation. "You break symmetry." 2. 1 symmetry was the problem. 3 matches could be attributed to 1 man. But 3 matches lit simultaneously from different positions. Impossible for 1 person. Impossible to ignore. Ashworth prepared 3 match points earlier, quietly, deliberately, with no flame. Now he lit them almost at the same second, north, west, and south. Kowalski whispered, "That'll force him to move." Ashworth finished, because when stimuli exceed known human capability, a sniper reverts to observation priority. He shifts to gather information rather than hide, and that shift, no matter how small, is directional. 1 German silhouette shifted barely a few inches, but inches were all Ashworth needed. The shot echoed once. The duel ended instantly. Kowalski swallowed. "If he'd been a little luckier, we'd be dead," Ashworth said quietly. Luck is the tax on imperfect systems. It's manned O's, and the German had finally understood the system, just not fast enough. The day ends with exhaustion and certainty. By the time daylight faded, Ashworth had pushed the Matchbox Trick further than anyone could have imagined. Static hides, moving patrols, backlighting, misdirection, sequencing, routing behavior, and finally dueling logic. But day 4 wasn't the victory lap. It was the limit test, and as Ashworth's matchbox emptied and German discipline frayed, the forest itself was about to change in ways neither side expected. By the end of December 12th, something had shifted in the forest, something deeper than casualties or lost positions. A new enemy had entered the German lines. Fear, not fear of Ashworth, not fear of an unseen sniper, fear of light. It started quietly. German survivors from the first patrols whispered warnings: don't look at flares, don't track sparks, don't acknowledge tiny flashes in the dark. Then it spread because nothing in their doctrine could explain why men who simply turned their heads were dying before they could shout a warning. At first, officers dismissed these fears as panic, but by mid-after, noon on the 12th, reports from 3 companies showed the same behavior: soldiers refusing to check illumination, observers ignoring flickers, radio operators averting their eyes, snipers delaying scans, patrols freezing at minor reflections. Doctrine had been turned upside down. The manual said light identifies threats. Ashworth had made light become the threat, and once that inversion took hold, it became a contagion. German soldiers stopped marking muzzle flash windows. They stopped identifying reflective metal. They stopped checking burning brush or flare residue. They even stopped watching the glow from their own cigarette embers. In a forest where 90% of battlefield information came from visual anomalies, Ashworth had effectively turned off one of the Germans' primary senses. Kowalski noticed it first. "Bill, they're not scanning. They're scared to is see they're blind by choice." Ashworth said that's worse than being blind by terrain, Ender, because blindness caused by terrain is neutral. It changes the battlefield for both sides. Blindness caused by fear is asymmetric. It cripples only one army, and the effect was immediate. German firing discipline collapsed. Soldiers shot late or not at all. Machine gunners hesitated before firing at movement because they feared the flash would reveal them. Snipers refused to lean into firing slits. Situational awareness broke down. Patrols walked past American positions without registering them. Fire teams stopped responding to reflective glints or bursts of brightness. Even artillery spotters ignored signals they were trained to react to. Command cohesion fractured. Officers couldn't rely on visual reports because subordinates refused to look. Runners circulated contradictory information. Don't turn your head toward anything bright. If you get the forest became a fog of self-imposed ignorance. Ashworth hadn't just disrupted German sniping. He destabilized their combat culture, the way German troops processed threats, the way they shared information, the way they understood danger. This was the Matchbox Trick at its most dangerous form, not a method of killing, but a method of erasing an army's confidence in its own instincts, and fear spread faster than bullets. By late afternoon, Ashworth witnessed the strangest phenomenon of the entire battle. A German squad stopped advancing because sunlight reflecting off a piece of shattered metal flickered like a match. Nobody moved, nobody checked, nobody dared verify. Kowalski whispered, almost disbelieving, "They froze because of a reflection. 2 reps, no." Ashworth said they froze because light means death now. This wasn't tactical defeat. This was cognitive collapse. Captured prisoners confirmed the effect. One German private said, "We were told the American could kill you through light." Huad. Another said, "My commander said, do not turn your head. But if you do not look, you cannot survive either." Regga, the most revealing comment came from a lieutenant. "We believed he could see through walls. We believed he hunted our thoughts, not our bodies. If you go, that was the psychological breaking point. A trick is dangerous. A myth is lethal." The Germans weren't fighting a sniper anymore. They believed they were fighting a phantom, an entity who punished reflexes, anticipated reactions, and weaponized their training against them. Military historians often call this moment degraded combat effectiveness. Man too sterile. The Germans were experiencing behavioral shutdown, the inability to perform trained actions because performing them had repeatedly resulted in death. Ashworth had inverted their threat model. He turned soldiers into statues. He turned officers into doubters. He turned doctrine into a liability. And he did it without a single shouted order, without a single psychological unit, without ever stepping into their lines. All it took was light. Light that didn't kill. Light that exposed nothing. Light that changed the meaning of the forest. By nightfall, German units in the sector weren't fighting the Americans, they were fighting the next match that might appear, and that meant one thing. Day 4 wouldn't just be lethal. It would be decisive. When darkness fell on December 12th, the matchbox was empty. 48 wooden matches had reshaped an entire sector of the Hürtgen forest. One rifleman had erased a network designed to stop battalions, and a 4-day window of innovation had outmaneuvered years of doctrine. But the numbers, 119 confirmed kills, dozens more from artillery he directed, weren't the real story. The real story was what those numbers meant. A system had collapsed. German sniper doctrine in Hürtgen wasn't flawed. It was efficient, it was disciplined, and in most sectors it was working until one man reframed the battlefield. Ashworth didn't overpower the system. He invalidated it. He didn't outshoot better marksmen. He removed their ability to behave like marksmen. He broke not their bodies, but their decision-making loops. No manual prepares an army for that. 2. The Americans advanced because fear changed direction. For 2 weeks before Ashworth arrived, American infantry had stalled every eine sniper trap. Every ravine a kill zone, every movement punished instantly. But after December, tall sniper casualties in the sector dropped to 0. Patrols advanced without fire. Machine gun nests went silent. German resistance cracked where it had been firm. Ashworth hadn't cleared ground. He'd cleared mental space. The space soldiers need to believe movement is possible. The infantry didn't surge forward because the enemy died. They surged forward because the enemy stopped acting. 3. The trick was never about matches. This is the part most retellings miss. The Matchbox Trick wasn't about flame, light, or deception. It was about predictive leverage, identifying a reflex embedded so deeply in training that it could be triggered on command. Ashworth didn't create a new weapon. He discovered a vulnerability in human behavior and applied pressure until the system broke. That's why the trick worked. That's why it scaled. That's why German countermeasures failed. When the enemy's weakness is structural, every fix becomes another flaw. 4. And that's why the Army never taught it again. After the engagement, division headquarters wanted to record the method, replicate it, turn it into doctrine. Ashworth refused because he understood something tacticians rarely admit. A tactic becomes useless the moment it becomes standardized. If the Matchbox Trick spread, the Germans would adapt. If the Germans adapted, the vulnerability would vanish. If the vulnerability vanished, the trick would die. But if it remained personal, one man, one forest, one moment, its psychological shockwave would continue long after the matches burned out. And that's exactly what happened. Captured prisoners later said units in the sector refused to react to light sources for weeks, crippling their night operations, their signaling discipline, and their ability to track American movements. Ashworth's trick didn't work for 4 days. Its effect worked for the rest of the campaign. 5. The lesson was bigger than the battle. Years later, when historians tried to categorize Ashworth's performance, they struggled. It wasn't marksmanship alone. It wasn't fieldcraft alone. It wasn't improvisation, bravery, or luck. It was the purest form of tactical innovation. Find the one behavior the enemy cannot stop doing, then make that behavior kill him. Modern armies call this behavioral exploitation. Modern strategists call it decision cycle disruption. Modern psychologists call it reflex hijacking. Ashworth didn't use those terms. He used matches, but the idea was the same. A soldier is not defeated when he is shot. A soldier is defeated when he follows a rule that no longer protects him. That is the real legacy of the Matchbox Trick. Not the 119 kills, not the rifle, not the myth of a ghost sniper in the forest. The legacy is this: warfare rewards the mind that refuses to fight the last battle. Victory comes to the one who rewrites the rules before the enemy knows the rules have changed. Ashworth did that with 48 pieces of wood and a single insight, and an entire forest of trained, disciplined professionals fell to it. Not because the match was powerful, because the mind using it was.